Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how you introduce Brian, and I've noticed that the past half hour you've been going around introducing yourself to everybody anyway. It really is an impossible task. I'm sure that most of you have been to a presentation of Brian's in the past, and I could spend the first 10 minutes reading through that incredible list of academic achievements, which are absolutely fascinating. But then we have to wake the audience up again at the end. I could tell about my family and your family coming from now the same little Welsh village, and every time they ask, how's that Brian doing, I'm able to say, well, that's fun. That word heritage on the screen is what I almost think of now with Brian, because he has become part of Kingston's heritage. As a historian and as a geographer, and as mixing those two, he always gives to me a totally new viewpoint whenever I hear him speak, and for a long time afterwards thinking of just what he has said and how he has fitted so many diverse ideas together. And Brian, I'm sure you're going to do that tonight. Welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very nice introduction indeed. I'm concerned because I'm sure some of you have been in later life learning or Probus or various other groups heard some of this talk before, but as I used to tell my students, they complained on times I used to give out the same questions in exams. I said the questions are the same, but the answers are different. So perhaps you'll find that there are some differences in some of my presentations here. We're looking at heritage, the local heritage, the national, the international, and they all interact. And as you know, this talk was advertised as a concept under pressure at the moment, locally and worldwide. And I'll try to address issues that relate to pressing problems at these various levels. And I turn to a major authority, of course, Yogi Berra, who said, the future ain't what it used to be. And that's very much the case. The future as we used to conceive of it isn't what it is at the present time. But what is heritage? An inheritance from the past, patrimoine, an endowment, a valued possession, a memento. And increasingly, it's a value, it's a resource, and it's a dilemma in the modern world. Ferdinand Braudel wrote in a wonderful classic book, The Identity of France, spoke of heritage as having a massive weight of distant origins, both convincing and terrifying. They're indeed a crushing burden on society with what to do with our patrimoine. At first, heritage, as you know, is informal and local. Stories you hear at your grandfather's knee, tales, myths, legends, the graveyards full of our ancestors and family that we protect and reserve. And in many ways, the First Nations are a perfect example of that oral tradition passing on to successive generations the important things in their quality of life. And for me, of course, as Peter alluded, I'm a geographer at heart, and the landscape is full. I can't go out, my children hate driving the car with me because I'm looking through the windshield at things, not at the road. I'm looking at barns and fences, and in downtown Kingston, little things people walk by, reminding us of an age of horse-drawn carriages and transport, and the skilled craftsmen carrying on their blacksmith tradition and so many other traditions of the past. And then there are those place names. Troy de Milwer, on the mountain above my valley village. The mountains were an important routeway, unforested. And there my grandson is leaning against a menhir, a Stone Age monument going back 4,000 years. And you might see a straight line behind it. That's a Roman road, 2,000 years ago. And 2,000 years later, we're looking at those traditions there. And I asked my father once, what does Troy de Milwer mean? Footprint of the soldier. Which soldier, he said? The Romans, the Normans, the Anglos, so many soldiers have passed. And the image on the right is Beir Llwynog, the grave of the fox. But I grew up, it's called Beir Llwynog. The Royal Engineer map makers came and they couldn't understand Beir Llwynog, so it was Beir Llwynog, it means nothing at all. But Beir Llwynog, the grave of the fox, and that farm there, my wife's family's farm, Pendika Vawr Vach, the head of the black field, the head of the big black field. And of course, you can't be, Peter Gow can say this, a long place name. But these place names are always tell stories, stories of place. And Kingston has a lot of these stories. Increasingly in Kingston and elsewhere in North America, we're recognizing the importance and role of our First Nations. In Kingston, we've ignored them for so long, but they were the first presence in where we are now, in particular the Mississauga, and then the French, Champlain and Frontenac, and then of course the Loyalists who took over the story for so long, and our military inheritance that's still so important today, the top employer in our Kingston area, but the military tradition, the military landscape, and Kingston's claim in the story of Kingston to leadership, metropolitan as well as national for one short period. And of course there are all those wonderful buildings that we preserve and protect, and heritage districts such as Barryfield, and even some of those buildings that are national memorials. Towers and domes, spires and fires, naves and naves. I won't go into those tonight, but those that punctuate our landscape and punctuate our history as well. And these are the very first focus. In 1966, the Old Stones of Kingston. 1970, the Kingston Heritage Act. 1976, the Ontario Heritage Act proclaimed in Kingston, and the Ontario Heritage Foundation was established. 1979, Barryfield Village, the first Heritage Conservation District. And now we have over 1,200 designated and listed properties. And I must speak more of Margaret Angus. Jennifer McKendry and I had a wonderful task of putting together a tribute to Margaret Angus, and her early work led to those buildings of architectural and historical significance publications. It must be up to volume 9 or 10 now. And people have taken over from Margaret Angus, Helen Finlay and Jennifer McKendry carrying on the good work. But when you look back at her presence as president of the Ontario Historical Society, she wrote this article in 1971, and she talks about it's more than economics and tourism or sentiment. It's preservation as a social and cultural benefit. That's the importance of heritage. It's meaningful. You can usually get the evidence of historical and architectural significance, but as symbols of the past, they have a direct emotional appeal. They give us a sense of continuity. They contribute to our sense of identity. Margaret Atwood understood fully what buildings meant in their cultural setting as well as their fabric and material presence. But we lost some. One of the problems we had was our focus on the old grey stones approach, and the famous Lions House on Ontario Street was torn away to be replaced by an early condominiums, a very attractive building, not one of those major massive elements there. Towed down to the east of town, where vandals burned it overnight, and we lost one of our early wooden buildings going back to Carlton Island and earlier. But we avoided this. We avoided the Terron project in those years, and the Terron project stimulated so much in the protection of our heritage. So many groups were formed, so many student groups, political groups, heritage groups formed, protecting that Terron monstrosity that was going to smother the downtown and eliminate so much of the old. So with new priorities, we have a new townscape. That old townscape was a question of commerce and trade, a process of commercialization, emphasizing our break and bulk point on the Great Lakes. And now we have a townscape emphasizing the retirement zones, the condominiums, the hotels, the tourist attraction, but still protecting so much of what we consider to be worthy. We went from this, trains and stations in front of City Hall, to that view, the mythic Confederation Arch linking the country together, perhaps questionably, but certainly a more attractive place. And we move towards this. We move towards the modern concept of urbanization, recognizing the need to have people living downtown and not commuting, bringing people downtown as part of the downtown economy, but still protecting the buildings in Sydenham and still protecting open spaces such as the Cataraqui Cemetery in that regard. So when Swainson and I did that first book in 1988, we were very concerned with what had been going on before. We were concerned with the warning, building on the past, a double entendre. Were we building on our past and destroying much of our heritage? But as a national project, heritage, it constructs Canada. We have to turn that imagined place through imagined narratives into a reality, Canada. We do it through school curricula, we do it through archives, museums, historiographies like the staple trade and so on, literature, Northrop Frye and Margaret Atwood emphasizing the Canadian literature, art, monuments, performances, and several government agencies. First, we had to build a capital as a symbol of national identity. That was done to dramatize the wonderful concept of Canada in a very insignificant place at that time, Ottawa. And then we needed a pantheon of iconic heroes. In 1895, the Toronto Globe made the point that we've reached that period in our history when we feel that it is good to commemorate the deeds of the great leaders who've acted their parts in our country's story. The national government has done but little in this direction. But from that time on, starting with Queen Victoria, following it up with Sir Johnny Macdonald, Cartier and others, we now have a rich pantheon of heritage and heroes on Parliament Hill. And was that last spike only about trays? Was it only about a guy bashing in the last spike as a technological development? It was far more than that. It was an integration of a nation state. That line as it moved west and that line as it moved east, at the end of that line as it was being constructed was the last post office in a system. And as they got together, we had the unification of the postal system. Letters now of all people in Canada could go far. Newspapers traveling, government reports coming. It was an integration process. And in fact, that all red line showed how it integrated empire. Transatlantic, trans-Canada, trans-Pacific to the Southeast Asia, through the Middle East, and back home around South Africa to Britain. It linked the empire together. The Dominion Archives was founded in 1872 as part of this creation of Canada, to preserve our documentary heritage for present and future generations, to be a source of enduring knowledge, to contribute to the cultural, social, and economic advancement of our society, to facilitate cooperation among communities involved in the acquisition, preservation, and diffusion of knowledge. Memory of the Government of Canada, 1872. 1885, Banff, the first national park. 1911, the formation of the Dominion Parks branch as elements of giving an imagination to our place as a nation state. 950 national historic sites now, places of profound importance to Canada. They're defining moments to human creativity and cultural traditions. Each national historical site tells its own unique story, but contributing a sense of time, identity, and place to our understanding of Canada as a whole. And as we know, our Marine Museum there, 1890, JAM did the cornerstone, 1892 it's opened, 1975 a museum, 1978 a National Historic Site, and now under pressure fighting for its life. 1873, the Northwestern Mounted Police became the RCMP in 1920, a political agency, a policing agency to protect Canada's claim to the West, but soon it became a symbol. I hate to ask how many of you saw that movie with Shirley Temple and no, don't put your hands up, it'll be embarrassing. But I wonder how many of you have also stood in front of the Parliament buildings to have your picture taken with that icon of Canada, the Mountie. The CBC in 1936, the National Film Board in 1938, all steps in the national integration. That icon above showing CBC, the all red Canada, it saw that role of the radio in linking Canadians together. The history of the CBC was closely tied to the Canadian National Railway. In fact, stations, and when you're on the Canadian National Railway, radio connection across the country. And then the National Film Board, there's that first film of Evangeline to tell stories of our Canadian culture. But soon after that, of course, the focus was on World War II, communicating to Canadians, our role in that battle. And then we had a symbolic engagement with the homeland, the group of 7 artists. They wanted to imbue the nation with an idea that an art must grow and flower in the land before the country be a real home for its people. There they are sitting there with Tom Thompson looking out at us, and that landscape became the iconic landscape of Canada. So building a nation required that concept. I love that image on the top left there of the Saskatchewan flag, the red ensign. The red ensign, the original flag of Canada, been modified by provinces. There we have the other symbolic themes, the maple leaf and the beaver. And as the recent discourse is taking place about the national flag, we see the beaver is chewing on the maple leaf, a sign of internal self-destruction in many ways. And then we have the old flag, the old policy, the old leader, Sir John A., demonstrating our imperial link. And then we have all these commemorations, the marriages and weddings and funerals. And there's King George VI and Elizabeth unveiling the National War Memorial. And of course, our symbolic landscape represented in that, the isolated northern pine, the west wind, all those images of the north with a theosophist set of lines streaming down from heaven above. So we've had an emerging local view, we've had an emerging national view, and now we have an emerging global view. And we go back again 2,000 years, Herodotus' 7 wonders, the pyramids of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, Zeus at Olympia, and off we go, all those that we learned about in our school texts, in our high school texts. But Herodotus called them was thaumata, things to be seen. And there's an early tourist looking back at the landscape there of the 7 wonders of the world as an early tourist. And it was the grand tour for some, the grand tourist, the grand tour, all the way from Britain into the Low Country, down the Rhine, up the Rhine actually, through the Alps and down to Rome, to see the art, to see the architecture, to see the beauties for the upper classes. They were the first tourists. The grand tourists, sightseers and collectors in Venice and other parts of the modern world. And the first protection to all of this came through calamities of war. The Lieber Code in 1863, the Declaration of St. Petersburg, 1868, the Brussels Declaration, 1874, the Hague Convention, 1907, and Versailles, 1919, and of course the threat of World War II later, the destruction, the threat, the terrorist bombing and destroying the Buddha, and then the Bridge of Mostar. An enlightened approach to war, is that possible? But the progress of civilization should have the effect of alleviating as much as possible the calamities of war, that the sole legitimate end that states ought to consider during the war is the weakening of the military forces of the enemy. Soldiers, keep your attention on the fight and not destroy culture, not destroy civilization. And then we have Picasso's Guernica in 1937, Guernica, the first mass bombing or air bombing in the Spanish Civil War, drawing attention to what was to come in World War II. And Dresden and Hiroshima in 1945, the pictures of the original landscape above, the pictures produced by that mass bombing, the horrors of that World War II period. It led, that destruction led to the foundation of UNESCO. 4th November 1946, a declaration to contribute to peace and security by promoting collaboration among nations through education, science, and culture. A worldwide initiative, a worldwide mission, and supported by the new Charter of the United Nations as part of an identity. And then there's an increasing concern for the global patrimony, as you all know. The World Heritage Convention in 1972 had been prompted by events going on in the previous decade. The Aswan Dam, the threat for memorials and monuments such as Abu Simbel, recognizing the need to protect culture. There they are removing the Abu Simbel monument before it was flooded and putting it to a site to be preserved for the future. There we have Nasser and Khrushchev at the opening of that dam. It's all to do with cultural heritage, and the natural heritage are being threatened with destruction by causes of decay and changing social and economic conditions, something we're going to talk about in our present condition in 2015. So now the World Heritage Organization is worldwide and it's complex. Over 1,000 sites, and 46 are in danger at the present time in various parts of the world for various aesthetic reasons, structural reasons, financial reasons. We'll be looking at the concern. But who is in control? The World Heritage Sites belong to all the people of the world. UNESCO seeks to encourage the identification, protection, and preservation of these sites, considered to be of outstanding value to humanity, the OVH clause. For a protection process, something has to be recognized of outstanding value to humanity. We've had other dimensions too. The most misunderstood one, the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. Incidentally, Canada didn't sign this. Why wouldn't Canada sign it, do you think? I'll leave it to you to think about. But what are the elements of the first 7 intangible heritage? Number 1, the Southern Diet as part of the World Heritage, the Southern Diet. The tango, part of World Heritage. Weaving in Iraq and rug making in Iraq. Tango Nuevo on King Street has a tango club downtown. It's a wonderful experience to be having a glass of beer and watching tango dances in that restaurant there. 2005, the Chan Declaration, considering the setting of heritage, to add to the building, the fabric, the structure that we're all so familiar with, social and spiritual practices. I have that image there of the First Nations signing treaties, their images, their tribal insignias. Customs, traditional knowledge. They're my oldest and second oldest sons on the right there. They know a lot about hunting. And then we have the wine gathering and the concepts. And then 2007, the Enami Charter, the interpretation and presentation of cultural heritage sites. Heritage conservation is a communicative act. So we have to disseminate it, popularize it, present it, interpret it. It's not an academic exercise to be isolated. 2008, the Quebec Declaration on the Preservation of the Spirit of Place. What is the essence of place? The ambience of place, the quality of place, the quality of life as part of the understanding of various places. Porto, with its ancient tradition of wine cultivation and wine growing, but in Kingston we're struck constantly by the quality of the place in which we live, Kingston, the Market Square, Sydenham Ward, all these different places. And then we had the 2008 Charter on Cultural Roots. Diverse entities and communities strung out along certain lines of movement, linear, not site-specific. And we have to encounter the progress, kinetic viewscapes, the experience of traveling along the Douro Valley in Portugal, the experience of traveling along Hadrian's Wall, not just the stone in front of you, but that total experience of that it's an entity to be appreciated, and that's what's so important. And even perhaps especially, the World Heritage Organization recognizes industrial sites. The world I grew up with was very close to that one on the left there, a mining village. But now that's what it looks like on the right. Blainavon was the first World Heritage Industrial Site in 2000. Others in the Rhine, others in the Ruhr, others in Belgium and so on. And I don't know, about 40 years ago I made that point, landscape as context. Such elements of industrial landscapes as spoil heaps, slag heaps, and derelict land are prime indicators not only of the impact of industry upon the land, but also the value system of the society that produced them. Some of you might recognize that image on the top left. That's a place called Aberfan. And that slag heap, that spoil heap moved down and killed close to 200 children in that flooding that took place about 40 years ago. More recently, I've made the point, by restoring past industrial landscapes, we lose tangible expressions of the context and setting of the industrial processes. And also we lose evidence of intangibilities, attitudes too, and the values of material progress. So certainly we have to understand this industrial world that for 2 centuries was so much part of our culture and identity. We have to understand the nature of that process. David Lawrensell wrote about heritage, crusade, and the spoils of history. And at the time he wrote that book in '96, he made the point that heritage is now everywhere, in the news, in the movies, in the marketplace, in everything from galaxies to genes. It's the chief focus of patriotism and a prime lure of tourism. One can barely move without bumping into a heritage site. The whole world is busy lauding or lamenting some past, be it fact or fiction. National identity picks up on heritage, be it mythic or true, and even the marketing, the branding of products ties in with this heritage identification. So what are the challenges and opportunities in 2015? World heritage is under increasing threat. The Tower of Pisa is leaning. No, it always was like that. That's why we go and see it, isn't it? I thought that was an example of the cutbacks. Accelerated deterioration, rapid urbanization, armed conflict, natural calamities such as floods and earthquakes and fires, heavy tourism, and government cutbacks are part of the problems affecting our modern heritage world. So there are old and new problems. I love that one on the left, that's Pompeii, destroyed by that volcano behind it, Vesuvius, in 78 AD. But I've often thought if I put a red line along the top and the line of Vesuvius for showing Italian government investment in heritage, investment is dropping down to the right, and Pompeii now is under a new threat, no funding to perpetuate it. The fear of earthquakes and floods, and now of course ISIS hitting Shiite temples that are World Heritage Sites, destroying the world at the present time. And then there are these ethical issues of heritage and protection. The great mosque of Dieni Mali. The town, when it's put on the heritage list, it means nothing should change. That concept we have in heritage so often of protecting our heritage, preserving our heritage. But we want development, more space, new appliances, this woman is saying, things that are more modern. While it may be good for tourism, residents complain of being frozen in time like pieces in a museum. This is the impact of heritage on the people who live in that town. The tourists want to come and see the authentic world, that authentic world of the temple itself, but also the people living around it. And then there's a need for flexibility. Imperial Delhi is being considered for heritage status now in 2015, but there's a concern that it would restrict development. And Christina Cameron has made that point of the danger of heritage designation. It's often led to the unintended consequence of freezing an historical frame, preventing legitimate evolution of added layers of value. In culture, things evolve and change and become new and dynamic, but so often there's a fear of this freezing process. And then we have the financial crises. Government budgets are under pressure and culture is a low priority. The Colosseum in Rome is falling apart. Massive, wonderful palaces in Paris that were seats of peace treaties and so on are now being turned into hotels. There we are at Venice. Look at the Coca-Cola is putting money in to preserve it, but it needs a place for its signs to demonstrate its investment process, its branding and labeling. And Parks Canada is chain cutting its obligations too. In Pompeii, for example, the 2,000-year-old building that was once used by gladiators is now crumbling as rain is weakening its foundations. Most are concerned about the impact on tourism. Pompeii attracts 2.5 million visitors a year. But over the last 6 years, the Italian state has halved its cultural budget and it's suffering in consequence. In Rome, Italy has 49 UNESCO heritage sites. It has an annual budget down 50% from the 500 million euros. Rome's new mayor has declared Rome an open city whose rich heritage belongs not just to Romans or Italians, but in his words, to the heritage of mankind. The mayor of Rome is paraphrasing the World Heritage Mission in its foundation. He's identified 20 projects and looks for the Friends of Rome with a collective bill of 200 million euros, close to $300 million. Diego della Valle, Todd's luxury leather goods, 22 million for the Colosseum. The fashion house Fendi for the Trevi Fountain. Bulgari Luxury Jewels, the Spanish Taps. They're turning to private enterprise to do what governments used to do in the past. The strategy is clear. Tourism is a new economic and social force in the world, as we know, and the current scale and future growth has serious implications for local and global environments. It's a money maker, it generates funds, it generates facilities, but also it's a threat. How many of you have been on trips and tours, walking along streets crowded with tourists like that? In 1980, there were 300 million international tourists, 2,600 million, and it's estimated that by 2020, there'll be 1.6 billion estimated tourists in the world. And domestic tourism exceeds international tourism. And this tourism is a major employer, employing 8% of the world total of employees. It's an economic problem, an economic contribution and a problem. But then the argument is that sustainable tourism can be a contribution. It sustains, it enhances the environment, the culture, the aesthetics, heritage, and the well-being of its residents. But we must constantly ask the questions, by encouraging tourism, are we sustaining and enhancing the character of that place? So Canada in 2015, what's happening? Well, here, of course, we've also lost well-established economies with globalization and decreased government support for heritage. We have pressures on municipal tax bases. We have aging infrastructures. We have escalating demands for social service and amenities. And we have political agenda and priorities. Some politicians don't regard and value heritage. The Library and Archives of Canada has had cutbacks. In 2008, it had a $172 million budget, and it spent close to $400,000 on purchases. 2012 to 13, the budget is down to $117 million, and it only spent $12,000 on purchases. In the year before, it spent $0. CBC cut back. 2014, 10% cut. But on the other hand, the government spent $28 million on the War of 1812, and I don't know how much for the search for Franklin. And then we have problems with Parks Canada. There's that rhetoric of Parks Canada's mission: ensure Canada's historic and natural heritage is protected through its 44 national parks, 167 national historical sites, and 4 marine conservation areas, and invites Canadians and people around the world to engage in personal moments of inspiring discovery at our treasured natural historic places. But 2012 to 13, close to 4,000 federal employees cut from 10 departments and joined the close to 12,000 from another 40 departments. 990 from Parks Canada's enrollment in workforce. 30% of the total workforce of Canada is being cut at the present time. Some Parks employees are arguing it's death by attrition. There's a nervousness that the intent is at some point Parks Canada won't be staffed by government employees. Perhaps an overstatement, but it's still an indication of a trend. But there's a new focus emerging on this creativity and human capital. Richard Florida hasn't written for a while now, but he made a major impact with that concept, the rise of the creative class. Arts, culture, and heritage organizations are key resources and incubators of creativity. Through their work, they create new cultural, intellectual, and economic opportunities, the rise of the creative class. And we're now in a new era of the quaternary sector, the experiential economy. Culture plus place equals wealth creation. To increase their capacity for wealth generation, cities must build culturally rich urban environments by better integrating 3 kinds of urban planning: land use, economic, and cultural planning. And we're seeing the excesses. I watched the Super Bowl, as did you, but I think more time was spent on the adverts and on the halftime show than on the game itself. It started at 6 and ended close to 10 o'clock with all that entertainment, and I could have put up the statistics of how much a minute of advertising cost and how much revenue was brought in by all the various activities, and the same with the Olympics above. So this is the new economy of wealth coming into our communities. So the cultural turn in municipal policy, Kingston, like other cities, are seeing new creative energies: creative cities, creative London, creative Berlin. We have recent influences in Kingston: the new urbanism, the creative city, the culture plan, the sustainable city, the tourist strategy are all new developments for the future. And Kingston, as in 2014, won the award as one of the intelligent communities of the year. So it's increasingly part of our mindset that the community well-being is an overlapping of those elements of the environmental plan, the economic, the social, the cultural, all together overlap to produce the community well-being. A creative city, a city for people, a landscape for ideas. This is what our concern is. We create and celebrate community identity, facilitate exchange, and understand among socially, economically, and culturally diverse groups and attract visitors and new businesses. Attract people to come to our community because of our vibrant, creative culture and quality of life. It's an ancient strategy. Confucius, he said, make the local people happy and attract migrants from afar. And that's what we're doing in many ways. And what's Kingston's future? If there's a tourist season, how come we can't shoot them, she says. It's a, but there we are, that great fear of massive tourism coming in. I'm afraid that view of the standard Rideau locks is not going to be on the right there, is not going to be part of our future with the cutbacks in staffing, cutbacks in locking time. But we are looking for more of the cruise industry, the cruise boats coming through. We must understand to what extent these will fit in to our environment. But the essential paradox is killing the goose for the golden eggs, a metaphor for any short-sighted action that might bring an immediate reward but ultimately will prove disastrous. And heritage is a non-renewable resource. It has to be protected. We can't commodify it into extinction. And the Tourist Association of Canada agrees. We must be looking for a sustainable tourism, concerned with the appreciation and stewardship of the resources. We must look at local residents. The tourism is viable over the long term. It results in a net benefit for the social, economic, natural and cultural environments of the area in which it takes place. It mustn't kill the goose laying the golden eggs. And the cultural vitality in our sustainable Kingston model, the cultural vitality element there, to create a vital, exciting, creative city. Preserve our unique heritage. Kingston does have a unique heritage. Celebrate artists, musicians, performers, writers and dreamers, nurturing our quality of life. Kingston Arts Council led the way in 1961, opposing the destruction of the Grand Theatre to make a parking lot, and is continuing its role at the present time as a leading enterprise. And the culture plan, as the first culture plan, again envisages a city in which all sectors of the community work together to enhance Kingston's distinctive identity, enrich the cultural life of residents, and attract newspapers, audiences, and visitors from around the world. We've mentioned the Arts Council, the Kingston Area Museums, the Heritage Committee, and a whole host of artistic, musical, dramatic groups throughout our vibrant culture. Look at our environment, the Agnes Etherington Centre, K-Rock that so many people are opposed to, but in many ways it appeals to a certain segment of our society, and we hope it will make money soon. The Beda Centre, the rich Grand Theatre and all it presents to our culture. And in fact, tonight at this time, there's a meeting going on in the TET Centre for Creativity and Learning, a conference on when arts meet business is going on tonight. The project is all about building bridges between the arts and the private sectors, so actually creating partnerships, creating projects, and building relationships and getting to know people. This is what we're all about in a new, vibrant approach to our economy. We have adaptive reuse. Look at the adaptive use of the S&R building, the old fire hall, the Cornerstone, the old Richardson Business Centre. They flourish over time. The technologies are adapted. The original use is no longer required. New needs arise, and they adapt to the changing demands we put on them, and we should be doing more of that. Now, we have had recent challenges, of course, as we know. The Rideau, Kingston Mills there, the Bailey Broom Factory, and of course the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes. Starting with the UNESCO designation of the Rideau in 2007, it was an early 19th century slack water canal system, and that's what the engineering technology, transportation technology and advancement in North America, and of course the ensemble of military fortifications to protect it, an important element and mark in our fight to maintain our independence from the United States at that time. Now the fortifications are well defended. Fort Fright does well, and from the very beginning, the concept of Fort Henry with the Fort Henry Guard and its dramatization of military activities, and now the Interpretive Center, the Discovery Center, new heritage technology, new interpretations. It's very much perhaps the way to go in the new museumology culture. One wonders, however, if it's going to fit into the concept of a World Heritage Site in terms of authenticity and heritage, but certainly it's flourishing and doing well. But the canal is collapsing. Ken Watson, perhaps the chief fighter in defense of the Rideau Canal, has mounted that campaign, Save Our Rideau. The Friends of the Rideau are concerned with protecting that heritage. Lack of funds has always been a problem, but it's been made worse in recent years by the lack of heritage support by the Government of Canada and is now at crisis levels. There's a backlog of needed work of 104 million. Locks alone, 50 million. Ottawa, close to 6. Hog's Back, close to 6. Long Island, 12 million. Kingston Mills, 9 million. These are big dollar figures for maintaining the structure of the Rideau Canal. But you've got to keep an eye on the dams too. It's that slack water system required on the construction of dams that flooded out the rapids and produced those long navigational reaches. They have to be maintained. They have to be protected and preserved. Otherwise, we'll have not only the flood and the damage along the Ottawa River area and in the Rideau area, but also a complete elimination. In fact, in the past, there have been many severe floods, and the Rideau could flow down to Gananoque as it did originally before we constructed the Rideau. But what is the future for the Rideau? I was at a recent consultants' discussion on the Rideau, talking about giving lectures in the abandoned, dried-out locks. Now, that's not, the one below isn't the Rideau, that's the Erie, the original Erie, where the new Erie bypasses it, but the old Erie now is an abandoned set of locks. So you can go and give talks about 19th century lock construction and have the architectural contribution examined and so on. In the conference session, they even talked about building restaurants next to abandoned locks. And with windows, you can watch people swimming in swimming pools where the locks used to be in this move towards making money out of the Rideau. But the threat that's presently before us is the Rideau will be, the lock constructions won't take place, or reparations won't take place, that there'll be dried out locks. The through movement, the continuous movement from Kingston to Ottawa will cease. There'll be series of navigation experiences, but not a major Rideau Canal. Then what about the Museum of the Great Lakes? We know what it was originally, tied in with Kingston's shipbuilding industry, tied in with the whole enterprise there of repairing the vessels, applying the Great Lakes, a major heritage center being protected. I can't believe that people aren't understanding the power of that museum in the heritage profile of Kingston, given all the rhetoric of the heritage plan, the culture plan, the tourism plan, and so on. But it's a waterfront property that will raise money, I'm sure, because of the real estate value. And now we have the quay, the harbour that could be used for cruise lines and cruise ships. It's a vibrant, vital opportunity to be part of Kingston's cultural plan. And then there's the Bailey Building, the Bailey Broom Building. It's a community in action. Questions of the integrity of a park, a threat of the Wellington Street roadway extension, the possibilities of a cultural centre there, and of course the community identity, investing in the north end of Kingston in that development process. The Bailey Building can fit into the restoration that's going on there already. The dry dock, the woolen mill, the lead refinery and tannery were there too. This was a vibrant part of Kingston in the late 19th century. And now then there's the concern of bringing that old CN station there, the first last spike, the place where the Grand Trunk trains met in 1857, the meeting of the Montreal train, the meeting of the Toronto train, the exchange of newspapers. That gave Sir John A. Macdonald the idea of the first last spike. But now they're thinking of moving that CN railway station down into that same area to make it, again, an industrial park, but tied in with the development of Douglas Feuer Park. So, heritage is a complex problem. Patrimony, the Heritage Crusade's concern was the importance of heritage globally, nationally and locally, and need to protect and celebrate it and the contribution it made to the quality of life and our experience of living. But economics, the economic opportunity offered by culture, heritage tourism, and associated enterprises is important for economic development in a world seeking new quaternary sector initiatives in heritage. And then there are the threats, a growing concern about the destruction of the heritage resource by the tourist industry, signaled by that term, the devil's bargain, the creative destruction, geese and the golden eggs, all of these metaphors for what a bad strategy of tourist development could do to heritage. And there's that major ethical question, the recognition of the ethics, social justice and wisdom of involving local inhabitants in determining heritage priorities and their impact on daily life of the host regions and societies. This is found everywhere in the world. Sometimes it raises its ugly head in Kingston, people arguing for developments of their homes, presenting them to the Heritage Committee. Certainly people along the Rideau concerned that the World Heritage Site has stopped the development of tourism and cottage building along the Rideau. And even in the city itself, Ottawa itself, concerns that we can't build lines across the Rideau because of heritage concerns. Matters of ethics, matters of individual rights and freedoms affected by heritage. So our new mission is the future. Kingston, we're now building on the past for the future that we hope to install. And remember the wise words of a pro, my chief academic authority in this proposal. If you don't know where you're going, you wind up someplace else. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Sir.
Well, you've certainly identified all of the problems, well, most of the problems. Finding a solution is probably the biggest problem. And that by itself would probably somewhere along the line suppose a great battle between two forces.
So there's the comment there, that in searching for solutions, we have to work out what motivates people in their solutions. And that exactly is what we're referring to. That when you bring in tourism as a strategy, there's money there. But what motivates investors in tourism is profit, is money, increased numbers, increased capacity. And I've wondered if they're going to be sensitive to a concern with protecting the resource. We understand that if we're talking about coal, if we're talking about firewood, if we're talking about other ecological resources, but the same thing applies to heritage. To exploit it and maximize people's use of it, there's a difficult road to pass, to cross, to follow. We have to try to maintain that sustainability of the heritage commodity that they're selling, they're marketing, they're experiencing in that experiential economy. So you're quite right, that is one of the major problems indeed. You had a question, sir?
Yes, some people might say Kingston has more heritage than it can afford. And, you know, I can understand that problem when we have so many wonderful buildings. And the city has taken over some of them and has done good work on them, but there's very much a limit to what the city can do. And of course this impacts directly on the question of the Marine Museum, and it will certainly impact very directly on the development of the Kingston Penitentiary site.
The point being made is that Kingston has so much heritage, in fact, so much heritage we might not be able to afford it all the wonderful buildings we have. But all the insights in the Kingston heritage goes beyond buildings, goes beyond the edifice complex, goes beyond that's the core, but it's the stories, the experiences, the culture, the values of the community as well. So, for example, to a non-growth ethic for Kingston, what is the optimal population for Kingston, not what was predicted back in the 60s and 70s. It was supposed to be 400,000 now, by the growth ethic of that period then. But the quality, what people come to Kingston for is that medium-sized, small town, walkabout experience with diverse activities. So there could be revenue coming to maintain those properties, major expenses I know, through that environment, through that economic initiative of personality of place, of the experiential economy. That is the only hope in many ways. I can't see government pouring in big money again in the future. If the economy came around and we became a booming economy again, perhaps we could be arguing and hitting for to prevent those cutbacks. But so many parks in Canada, not just the Rideau, are being eroded by staff cuts and then the lack of maintenance of the properties, the interpreted properties and so on. So you're quite right, we have a lot of heritage. We have a tremendous amount of it. There are cost implications. That's what our cultural officers have been trying to fight for and persuade us to support politically. I mean, Montreal, I think, has a plan of $30 per capita of its population for culture and heritage. Toronto is $27 per capita as an investment. I don't know what our figure is per capita in Kingston, but other cities are recognizing that to perpetuate the profile of the city, the character of the city, you have to invest in it, and therefore we have to pay for it. So perhaps we're saying taxpayers as well as the revenue coming from the marketing of heritage as well. I'm not answering your question, sir. I'm just exploring possibilities. Yes?
And I figure that the point about heritage versus tourism is that even though, sure, people will travel, but the reasons behind attracting tourism is not necessarily about satisfying people who want to travel, but about bringing in money.
The gentleman has raised the issue of tourism as a strategy, and what is the motivation of the tourist to come to a place? Is that what as I'm getting it? We have to read their minds and find out what they want?
The thing that we're focusing more on attracting tourism than we should, because it's not that people don't tour, but that are building things to attract tourism and are spending more on tourism.
Well, is it economic to build the things for tourism? But when you put it in that context of a tourism market, you see, the costs of the investment go on the invested in the tourism, the improvement of hotels, the improvement of our dining facilities, and the wonderful array of restaurants we have in town. In the summer, I love walking around Kingston and seeing people walking around the streets in groups, usually a father and a mother and three little kids toiling along, looking at the built environment, the unique cultural landscape of downtown Kingston. But also, when you can't get your preferred table in Chez Piggy in the summer because it's full of tourists, I've got to say well done, even though I'm grumbling about it. There is money to be made in the tourist sector, in the tourist economy, and that's increasingly what all the statistics are suggesting. It can grow. I was in a conference in Australia about 5 years ago, and the speaker before me was making the point that European tourists are not going to Australia anymore, and the Americans are backing off. And he said, but Chinese tourists are coming to Australia. And someone made the point, but what about the middle class? They're the tourists. He said, oh, the middle class is only about 30–40% of China at the present time. But 30–40% of 1.5 billion is more than the population of Europe and of America. You know, you have to sort of adapt to the new environment of tourism. And the world tourism is, in fact, Limerick University, the economics department now has a special program on the economics of tourism. Tourism is a growth for the nation state. So there is to be money made from tourists, but then the question is, it's appropriate tourism, it's sensitive tourism. And I think Kingston does a very good job on that at the present time. But the thought of tour boats coming, the size of the tour boat is going to be critical, limited by the nature of the Great Lakes, and the blending in of them and absorption of them into our community. But tourism is worth thinking about and examining in terms of its benefits and possible dangers. Yes. Ma'am.
There seems to me to be something of an irony about
irony,
the evening, which is hosted by the City of Kingston. Well, one could argue the City of Kingston is doing a rather poor job of looking after the heritage of this city. We can list a number of things. department of the city
Yep.
has been decimated. The resource center has to find new digs. The Heritage Committee is undermined in its ability to look after, play its role as a steward. There's countless examples of the city not stepping up to preserve heritage, from the Marine Museum to KCVI. The Barrington Heritage Conservation District, its plan has been updated by know-nothing outside consultants. I mean, the list goes on. So the idea that this creative class kind of heritage cultural battle that makes it all look sort of splashy and groovy with Bader Center and so forth, but the real work of preserving heritage and recognizing, as you say, the tourist potential of preservation and conservation. I think that message is really hard to fight for in the city.
Where did the funding for the Barrowfield volume come from at the present time? The new Barrowfield, where did the funding for that come from?
Well, that was a heritage grant.
No, it came from CAM, right? The CAM allocation of funds for the city's heritage fund, yes, yes. I mean, there are, and then we go through that list of how many, $360,000 in investment in heritage through that CAM initiative, well, CAM handling and managing that city funding. So, in preparing this presentation, it's interesting that I looked at what we have, and certainly I'm aware of those problems you list, the ones you list. I should have added some more to the 3 I looked at. But you're quite right. But on the other hand, we've done pretty well. That's why people come and look at our place. And certainly the new council, I think, is going to get more sensitive to the heritage question. I think they are more open, and I hope they are. We want to speak to them and to point out what the priorities are in this new approach to looking at what the city is. Mrs. Angus did a wonderful job in her contribution back in the 60s and 70s. And we have other leaders at the present time trying to do the same thing, of looking to the future of the new economy that's worldwide. That's why it's not just Kingston. Think of what they're worried about in Italy, as I'm saying, where the tourist economy has been there for hundreds of years, and they're worrying about maintaining that, not just the heritage, but the tourist economy based upon the heritage, because they're cutting government funds, hence their initiative in seeking other activities. I think we have to improve our public awareness. The Bailey Broom Factory was a community initiative, a community fight. Barrowfield has had strong voices protecting its case. Sydenham Ward. All of these areas are community bottom-up approaches to government and influencing the council and saying, you're our representatives and we think heritage is a priority for the quality of life, our identity, as well as an economic contribution to the city. So I think that is part of the, but I do understand the battles, the many battles, and the big budget. Perhaps that's what I should have tried to do tonight, is come up with a budget for all the peoples and all the problem areas in the city at the present time. What is the impact at the present time, the cost impact for preserving our heritage in Kingston? Yeah.
I think though people see it as economic development versus heritage rather than...
Well, that's what I was trying to demonstrate tonight, that economic development is tied in many ways to heritage and consumers of heritage. You and I consume heritage constantly. We do it, and we don't. It doesn't cost us a penny for the emotional reaction to the beauties and intellectual interest in our heritage. But people travel here, stay in hotels, eat meals and so on. I remember Clark in the Bay years ago, he and I were on the train together, and I was saying I had an idea. I was going to sell heritage in Collins Bay. I was going to persuade all the suburban people in Collins Bay to come on a mystery tour with me, and I was going to get a bus, and I was going to pick them up. Without having told them where I was taking them, I was going to bring them to downtown Kingston, put them into a very good hotel. He immediately offered his hotel.